And if you think about that, a penny probably bought a lot more back in Ben Franklin's day than it does now. But we think about a penny now, and we see one laying on the sidewalk, and we go, I had to bend over if I want to pick that up. And sometimes we leave it laying there, especially if it's on tails. If it's on heads, we might pick it up because that's supposed to be good luck. So we look at, but we think about a penny, we really don't think about it having a lot of value now. And most of us probably have a jar or a cup or something on the dresser, and you empty your pockets out at night. I know I used to do this, and you would look at your change and you would throw the pennies in there and maybe keep the quarters, because most vending machines at work didn't take pennies. And so you would just sort of put those in, or you see people used to have a big jug, and they would just fill it up and with pennies, because just didn't really carry them around, and you didn't collect them. But this morning I want to use a penny as a object lesson to remind us of three important things in our lives. In the ancient world, the government minted coins, just like we do today, for commerce, and occasionally Jesus used those coins as lessons, object lessons, to teach things that he wanted people to understand. And I thought about this morning. I thought, I really would like to have given everybody a penny to look at while I was talking about this, but that wouldn't meet the COVID guidelines unless I put them all in little bags, and then I figured, how am I going to steal? I'm going to have to give them out. So just think about, you have a penny in your hand this morning as we talk about these, and I think it's some interesting things that he had to say using this. If you would turn to Mark 12, verse 41 through 44. This is Jesus' lesson on giving. And Mark 12, 41 through 44 said, Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrant. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, Surely I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given money into the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole living. And we often refer to this, and my Bible actually has a little heading over this paragraph. It says the widow's 2 mites. And so we often think about this story as the widow's mite or mites. And we see she put in 2 coins, and Mark is writing in the Greek, and he uses the word, he says a mite, which is called, in Greek, is called a lepton, and which is the smallest copper or bronze coin in existence at that time. And it was minted started minting these before the birth of Christ, and probably a lot of them minted, but because they were inferior metal and so forth, these very few, if any, have survived to this day. But he goes on to explain for the Roman readers the amount that the widow gave was equivalent to a quadrant, which is often translated cent or a penny in our terminology. And so when you think about what she put in the treasury, and you look at her day, the value of that, and you do some calculations, you can come up with some interesting numbers. And I'm going to do a few calculations for you here, hopefully. The common day's wage at this time was a denarius. And if we look in Matthew 20, verse 2, and when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into their vineyard. So we have essentially a day's wage is a denarius. And then among the Romans, a denarius would have been equivalent to 64 quadrants, which he talks about here, when she put in 2 mites, which was a quadrant. And if you divide up the work days, say they work 12-hour days, the monetary value of these 2 coins that she would have put in, one of these workers would have earned probably in a little over 11 minutes working. And so you think about that value. I mean, that's what she put in there was what a normal worker would earn in about 11 minutes. Now you put that in our terminology, in our today, what we would think, if you say the average person makes $15 an hour, and in 11 minutes, an average worker would make $2.77. And so, if you think about it, this widow had $2.77 to live on. And she put that money into the treasury. And we think about your situation. If you were down to $2.77 is all you had to live on. And we might say, I've been there before. I mean, I don't know that we could really say that we've been that low, but it's possible, I guess. But you get an idea of what she did, and that was all that she had. And that's what Jesus said. That's what he recognized here. And he said she had put in more than all the contributors to the treasury. And as we've said, this was the smallest valued coin in the culture at that time. But yet this is all she had to live on. And she surrendered that. She put that in the treasury. And what do they use the treasury for? Well, they used it to take care of the priest, and they needed it, ironically, to take care of other needy people, which she probably was one of those. And so when you think about what she put in there, she didn't put in more monetary value, because you know that there were lots of denarii and shekels and so forth that were put in the treasury that day. But in terms of what Jesus is talking about, he said she gave more because she gave what she had. And she did that while others were giving from their surplus or their abundance. And then Jesus points that out. So when you look at a penny, you think about a penny, remember Jesus' lesson here. The fact that we may not have what others have should not discourage us from doing what we can do to serve God. Sometimes people say, well, what little I can do ain't going to make a difference. It's not going to do much good. Well, God accepts that little bit that we can do, if that's what we can do, if that's what we're able to do. And you don't have to be wealthy to be generous. You can give of your time, and you can help other people as well. And Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 12 says, "For if there is first a willing mind, it is acceptable according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have." So it's an attitude thing. It's what's in our mind. But if we have more ability, if we have more money, if we have more talents, God expects more of us. So think about that from next time you see that penny. Think about that lesson on giving. Turn to Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Jesus gives a lesson on courage. In Matthew chapter 10, 29, he says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin? And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will." Now here Jesus urges his disciples to think about the value of a sparrow. And in the marketplace, they could be bought. He said there were 2 bought here for a copper coin. And so instead of using the word here that Matthew doesn't use the same word Mark used, he uses a different coin, an assarion. And you think about, okay, well, what's that? What's that worth? Well, you take the widow's 2 mites and you double that, and you have what this coin was that he said you could buy 2 sparrows with. And it seems as people in the marketplace here, people bought sparrows for food. You would maybe they would cook it, put it in some kind of pastry or put it in soup. I don't know what you make with a sparrow or a bird, but I guess you could make various things with that. And so they bought those, and it was probably a very meager meal. And so if you go back to the day worker, he makes enough to buy these sparrows in about 20 minutes of work. So what's Jesus' point? He says these 2 sparrows are not really worth much more than this copper coin or this Assyrian. And he said, but they don't fall to the ground that God doesn't know about it, that God's not aware of it. And if God knows what's happening to sparrows, then how much more does he know about what's happening to us? And when we're trying to do what he wants us to do, we're trying to follow his will, and we're trying to spread his word to other people. But again, look back at value today. We think about that. We took that number. We first said that those the widow's 2 mites was worth $2.77. This is double that. So these 2 sparrows are worth $5.54 in today's number. You think our lives are worth more than $5.54 to God? We think about that. I think our value, we would understand, is much higher. And I think that's the point Jesus trying to get them to understand. Your value as a child of God or as a follower of God is much more than what these 2 sparrows would be worth. But he said God knows about them. So when we think about going out and trying to do things, should we be afraid? And he says we should not be afraid of what men can do to us. We need to have the courage to speak up and to stand up for what's right, because God looks at us with that kind of value. And so next time you pull that penny out of your pocket to do something with it, think about, hey, I need to be courageous. God values what I can do, what I can accomplish in his work. And the last one that we're going to talk about, we're going to be done early today, just so you know. Luke chapter 12. People usually don't complain when you finish early. They will if you go over, but they won't if you finish early. Luke chapter 12, 54 through 59. Jesus again says to the multitudes, whenever you see a cloud rising out of the west, immediately you say a shower is coming. And so it is. And when you see the south wind blow, you say there will be hot weather, and there is. Hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky and of the earth. How it is you not discern this time? Yes, and why even of yourselves do you not judge what is right? When you go to your adversary, to the magistrate, make every effort along the way to settle with him, lest he drag you to the judge deliver you to the officer, and the officer throw you in prison. I tell you, you shall not depart from there till you have paid the very last mite. So Jesus chided this generation because they were really good at predicting the weather. They could see those signs. They could look at the clouds and figure out what the weather was going to be. He said, but they lacked spiritual discernment. They could not see what was going on in their nation. And they could not see the signs of God's impending judgment that were being displayed. God had already sent John the Baptist to prepare the way for Christ. And now Christ is in their presence and teaching and preaching and talking about God and talking about salvation, and they just seem oblivious to it. We talked about that in the class this morning. We talked about Jesus being rejected by people, being rejected by his own nation, his own people. And so Jesus urges this generation to quit waiting for someone else to tell them what to do and to make their own decisions. He says, you need to discern the time and you need to judge what is right here. And he uses this illustration then to tell them, sort of point out what he's trying to get them to understand. And he talks about a man who has an adversary who's taken him to court. And he says, what makes the most sense? He said, to settle the issue between your two or take your chances in court. And he says the man who delays in settling is going to end up in debtor's prison to pay off his debt. And if that happens, he said he will not get out of debtor's prison until he's paid the last mite. And the mite here is that small coin, 2 of which the poor widow put in the treasury. So he says you're going to be in debt. You're going to be in prison until you've paid the very end, the very smallest amount that's due. That's how long you're going to be there. And so he wanted them to understand the spiritual application that God's judgment is coming. And Jesus is there to guide them in the way of truth, but they have to listen. They have to discern what he's saying, and they have to make a judgment for themselves there. And we have to do the same thing. We have to make the same discernment concerning God's word. And we have to be reconciled with him while we have time and while we have opportunity. Because that's exactly what he's saying here. When you're headed to court, when you're headed to a judgment, you need to make your preparations before you get there. Try to make things right before you get to that point is what he's telling these people here. He said, because if you wait too late and you get to court and you get to judgment, you're going to have to pay till the very last thing is paid for. So think about those 3 things. 3 things that he talks about when you look at a penny. Again, it doesn't buy much, but it can teach us some valuable lessons. It can teach us a lesson about giving. It can teach us a lesson about being courageous, about speaking up and standing up for what's right. And it can teach us a lesson about being reconciled to God, about getting our lives, making the corrections and making the adjustments that we need to make in our lives now before we get to judgment. So, don't see it as a worthless coin. See it as a reminder of good things that we can do for God and we can do for the Lord. Things to think about this morning. As I mentioned, we're going to finish a little earlier, but I think it's some good points that we can learn from what Jesus teaches us using just very small things of things that we may think do not really have a whole lot of value and things that may not have had a lot of value to people in that day. But we're going to sing a song. Donald will lead us in a song in just a second. As we always say, we're here to help anyone who needs our help. If it's things that we need to pray about with you, we certainly would do that. People who listen to what we say and who have not been responsive to the gospel, we need to try to encourage them to do that. We talk about the steps that they need to take and steps that we have taken to be obedient to God's word and to hear and believe and make the confession and be baptized that our sins can be forgiven. We need to talk to people about that. We need to have the courage to talk to people about that, to make their lives right with God. If we can help you in any way this morning, we ask you to let us know as we stand and sing.